Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, April 29th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the U.S. works to stop an ICC warrant for Netanyahu. So over the weekend, Israeli media reported that Israel is expecting the International Criminal Court, the ICC, to issue an arrest warrant for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And of course, the U.S. and Israel are working together to prevent it. So Haaretz reported that the Israeli government is working under the assumption that arrest warrants for Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi could be issued as soon as this week. The report said that the U.S. is already engaged in an effort to block the warrants. So I haven't seen the court hasn't said anything publicly about this yet, and the U.S. hasn't said anything publicly about this yet. So far, this is just based on Israeli media reports, and I saw the New York Times and some U.S. outlets picked it up kind of later on Sunday night. So one of the reports said that Netanyahu is under unusual stress over the potential warrant and is leading a nonstop push over the telephone to prevent them, with a focus on contact with the Biden administration. Netanyahu did address this possibility in a statement on Friday, saying that an arrest warrant would not stop Israel's mass slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. He didn't use those words exactly, of course, but I'll read his quote. He said, quote, "Under my leadership, Israel will never accept any attempt by the International Criminal Court in The Hague to undermine its basic right to defend itself. While decisions made by the court in The Hague will not affect Israel's actions, they will set a dangerous precedent that threatens soldiers and public figures." So both the U.S. and Israel are not parties to the ICC, and the U.S. has a very contentious history with this court. Back in 2002, President George W. Bush signed a bill into law that authorizes the use of force to free any U.S. service member or government officials brought to the ICC, which is based in The Hague. And this law, it's officially titled the American Service Members Protection Act, but it has earned itself the nickname the Hague Invasion Act. So, you know, this is the court. The U.S. has a history of putting pressure on this court. The Trump administration sanctioned ICC officials for their investigation into alleged U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. The Biden administration reversed the sanctions but continued to put pressure on the court, which worked to drop the Afghanistan case. The ICC, after they lifted the sanctions, the ICC said that they were going to deprioritize its investigation of U.S. forces in Afghanistan and focus the investigation on the Taliban and ISIS-K. And that's another thing about the ICC. You'll usually see them. You know, I know the U.S. is also unhappy when they opened an investigation, or they said they were going to open an investigation into Israeli actions in Gaza and the West Bank. But they also said they were going to investigate Hamas, but that wasn't good enough for the U.S. They didn't want them to investigate Israel at all. So last year, if you remember, so we have this history of the U.S. working against the ICC. But after Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. backed ICC efforts to investigate Russians, and they backed the ICC. I believe they even provided them with, help, loosen some restrictions so they could provide information to the ICC. And they supported the ICC last year when they issued an arrest warrant for Putin. But of course now, they got their sights set on Netanyahu, and of course the U.S. is going to try to work against that. Even though Biden's so frustrated with Netanyahu all the time, according to all these leaks that we see. And so Israel is also facing pressure from the International Court of Justice. Of course, that's the ICJ, which is also based in The Hague. But basically the main difference between the ICC and the ICJ is that the ICC prosecutes individuals, while the ICJ deals with disputes between states, between countries. So this is just more that international pressure, and we'll see if these warrants actually happen. But this was all over Israeli media all weekend, pretty much. All right, so the next one here, Israel dismisses U.S. call to investigate Gaza mass grave. So Israel has rejected a call from the U.S. for an investigation into a mass grave that was discovered at Nasser Hospital in the southern Gaza city of Khan Yunis. U.S. officials have said they want Israel to investigate the situation itself, and the U.S. is not backing international calls for an independent investigation. If there was a State Department press briefing last week where the spokesman was asked about the mass graves and said, oh, yeah, we want Israel to investigate it. And the reporter said, you want the accused to investigate itself? And he essentially said, yeah. But even that's too much for Israel. They don't even want to go through with a phony investigation or anything. So when asked by Politico if Israel would conduct an investigation, Israeli military spokesman Nadav Shoshani said, quote, investigate what? We gave answers. We don't bury people in mass graves. Not something we do, end quote. So the Israel side of the story is that there was a mass grave already there at the hospital when its troops showed up, and that its forces dug up the bodies to look for Israeli hostages, then return them into the ground. But Gaza's civil defense agency said that only about 100 people were buried at the hospital before the Israeli raid, and a total of 392 bodies have been discovered. And I think it was a similar situation that we saw at other hospitals, is that it was under siege for a while and people were dying. So the Palestinians were digging graves and burying people, but they're saying that was about 100 people, and they found almost 400 bodies. And according to Gaza Civil Defense, they're saying that children were found in the mass grave and that there were signs of torture. And the Palestinians are calling for an independent investigation. Abu Sulaiman, the head of Gaza Civil Defense, said, quote, there are indications of carrying out field executions against some of the victims, while the bodies of other victims carried signs of torture and others were buried alive, end quote. And the UN is backing the Palestinian call for an independent investigation into the mass grave. A lot of other countries are as well. The best the U.S. can do is tell Israel to investigate itself, and Israel says, nah, we're not gonna do that. This whole first section we have on the page here is about how the U.S. is not doing anything to put pressure on Israel. I mean, some of these stories are just unbelievable. So the next one here, leaked USAID document concludes that Israel impeded Gaza aid. This article is from Brett Wilkins, who writes for Common Dreams, and we can reprint his stuff. So officials at the United States Agency for International Development concluded in a confidential memo to Secretary of State Antony Blinken that Israel is violating a White House directive by blocking humanitarian aid from entering the besieged Gaza Strip during its ongoing genocidal assault on the Palestinian enclave, according to a report published on Friday. So this was reported by Devix. I saw Reuters reported it as well. But it said this confidential communication entitled Famine Inevitable, Changes Could Reduce But Not Stop Widespread Civilian Deaths, states that USAID, quote, assesses the government of Israel does not currently demonstrate necessary compliance with the February 8th White House memo requiring the Secretary of State to obtain assurances from governments receiving U.S. military aid that such assistance is used in compliance with human rights law. So if you remember, the U.S. issued this memorandum, and they said they need assurances from countries that get U.S. military aid that they're not going to use them to violate international law, or they're not going to, and one of the assurances is that they wouldn't block U.S. aid shipments. And Israel said, yeah, we're not doing those things, and the State Department signed off on it. And it's completely ridiculous because they're building a pier because Israel's blocking aid shipments. They're dropping aid on Gaza, And of course, they're violating, the Geneva Convention, the way that they're carrying out this war. And the USAID memo also raises, it says that the killing of nearly 32,000 people may well amount to violation of the international humanitarian law. And what's interesting about this memo, this leaked memo, is that it says the government of Israel itself assesses that of the nearly 32,000 people that have been killed, roughly 2/3 are civilians. So that's apparently Israel assesses that. And this is 32,000. I'm not sure what the date was on this memo, but that was the death toll now is over 34,000. But this shows that, one thing you see from the Israel defenders in the U.S. is they're always questioning the Hamas death toll and the casualty rate. Now saying 2/3 are civilians, the Gaza health ministry has been saying that about 2/3 are women and children. So I would guess Israel might just assume every man is in Hamas or something. I don't know. But still, it goes to show that even by Israel believes that they've killed, over 20,000 civilians. So anyway, this just goes to show how those assurances were just complete nonsense. And I know the White House or the State Department has, there's going to be some sort of congressional hearing about these assurances, about this national security memorandum. So I'm sure some people in Congress might, some Democrats might make us think about it. But unfortunately, the reality is there's just not enough people in Congress that care. The vast majority of Congress still wants to keep giving Israel whatever they want. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. will not sanction Israeli military units that committed gross human rights violations. This article is from Kyle Anzalone. He wrote on Friday. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken sent a letter to House Speaker Mike Johnson explaining that 3 Israeli military units found to have committed gross human rights violations will not be prevented from obtaining U.S. weapons. So there was a report that the U.S. There's all these reports that last Monday that the U.S. was going to sanction an Israeli military unit over crimes that it committed in the West Bank, including killing an elderly Palestinian American. Small, what they consider ultra-Orthodox military battalion that the U.S. was apparently going to sanction and was going to say that they can't get U.S. aid. But that didn't happen. And I think it was clear that it wasn't going to happen after the day that, last week they said it was going to happen on this day, and then it didn't happen. And Netanyahu and other Israeli officials were publicly saying that the U.S. shouldn't do it. So I guess they convinced him. And apparently in this letter, Blinken is claiming that Israel had taken steps toward accountability and clarified the finding that 5 Israeli units committed gross human rights violations would have no impact on U.S. aid. Blinken wrote, quote, "The Israeli government has presented new information regarding the status of the unit, and we will engage on identifying a path to effective remediation for this unit. But this will have no impact on our support for Israel's ability to defend itself," end quote. So, and he's writing this to Mike Johnson, and it's not like Mike Johnson is going to say, "Oh no, you have to sanction them." Of course, he's not going to do that. So. Just another example. Like I said, the U.S. is just not going to do anything. I mean, Israel can just do whatever it wants, it seems like. All right, so the next one here, Israel threatens Rafah invasion if there's no hostage deal. Israeli officials are threatening to invade Rafah if a hostage deal is not reached amid Egyptian and Qatari-mediated negotiations with Hamas. Axios reported on Friday that Israeli officials told their Egyptian counterparts that Israel is giving Hamas one last chance to reach a deal. If an agreement is not reached, Israel will order a ground invasion of Rafah, which is packed with over 1 million civilians. Of course, it would be a slaughter. Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz said on Saturday that Israel could suspend its plans to launch an assault on Rafah if there was a hostage deal reached. And where those negotiations stand, there seems to be kind of a lot of conflicting information. But basically, what we know is that Hamas is currently reviewing Israel's latest proposal. and they're expected to give their formal response to Egypt and Qatar on Monday. Excuse me. And according to some media reports, Israel's proposal includes a initial exchange of hostages and prisoners, and then in a second phase, they say they can discuss the idea of bringing about a restoration of sustainable calm, which kind of sounds like maybe that's a ceasefire they're talking about there. Israeli officials are denying that the offer was an agreement to reach a permanent ceasefire or withdrawal or anything like that. And you know what Katz, what he's saying that they could suspend the Rafah operation, he's also saying that it doesn't mean they're not going to do it in the future. You know, the key word there is suspend. And so this language seems to be vague. You know, if Hamas is really only going to accept a deal if there's some sort of step toward a permanent ceasefire and Israeli withdrawal, I don't think it would be for vague language like that. But maybe we'll see what happens. So there was a Hamas official who told AFP on Sunday that there was no major issues with Israel's latest proposal. So that kind of signals maybe they're open to it. But at the same time, another Hamas official told Al Mayadeen that the Israeli proposal does not reflect a fundamental shift in Israel's position and that they were unlikely to accept it. So again, we see this with the hostage. Sometimes I just don't even bother covering this stuff because it's like so much conflicting information, and it just seems like there's never any real progress. But hopefully there is. You know, it would be good to see if there was some progress and some sort of ceasefire was agreed to and a big humanitarian relief effort could happen, even if, you know, it should be permanent. But I think if it was temporary ceasefire, it would be really hard for Netanyahu to restart everything. And, you know, of course, he doesn't want it. But we'll see. Maybe there'll be some progress. Because at the same time, you know, they're not winning. They're not beating Hamas. All right, so I just want to mention, again, it's our fundraiser at antiwar.com. And right now we have matching funds. So we're trying to raise $100,000 this time around. We've been moving along pretty good. And now we have $40,000 in matching funds that some of our very generous donors pooled together for us. And the catch is that we need to raise that amount in matching funds. And this is a way that you can double what you give to antiwar.com. So see the different ways you could help us out at antiwar.com/donate, and everything is tax deductible, so you could write it off. That's less of your money that goes to the war machine. So please help us out with that. This is how we get by. This is how we do it. Antiwar.com/donate. All right, so the next one here, UN Oversight Office closes probe of staff over alleged ties to Hamas. So this is another one from Kyle. This is at the Libertarian Institute. And it says 4 of the 12 employees of the UN Palestinian Relief Agency, UNRWA, under investigation by the UN's Internal Inspector's Office, had their cases closed due to lack of evidence. So in January, Israel claimed that 12 members of UNRWA participated in the Hamas attack on October 7th, leading many Western countries, including the U.S., to cut funding for the aid agency. And there was a report from a former French foreign minister that concluded Israel had failed to produce evidence to back the assertion. So the first thing that UNRWA did when Israel made these allegations is they suspended the 12 employees and started an investigation. And now so far, I believe there was one employee that they found no ties to Hamas. And then you have these other ones, these other 3, that there's no evidence. Hamas was not providing any, Israel was not providing any evidence, and then they closed that down. So a total of 4 employees' investigations have been closed because there's no evidence. And I remember a few weeks after the UN suspended these people, you saw UN officials admitting that we just suspended them on Israel's word. You know, we didn't have any real evidence. All right, so the next one here, UK troops could be sent into Gaza to help with aid deliveries. So this article is from Middle East Eye, and this would be pretty crazy. British troops could be deployed to Gaza to assist with aid deliveries after the U.S. said it would not be sending any of its own ground forces. The U.S. previously said that a third party would be responsible for driving trucks along a floating causeway onto the beach, a role the BBC has learned could be filled by British forces. The BBC on Saturday quoted Whitehall as saying that no decision had yet been made and that the issue had not yet been raised with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. So, kind of weird that the BBC reported this, but at the same time, the Prime Minister hasn't even heard about it. Because this, I would think, this would be a pretty, you're just asking for it to put British troops in Gaza. So, of course, the UK is very supportive of Israel, and they could be attacked, and it would just be could be a total disaster. Like this whole project seems to be like it's going to be a total disaster. The first day we hear that there's construction, there's also like a rocket attack on the staging area. And again, this is what the U.S. is doing instead of just pressuring Israel to open more land crossings into Gaza. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. and Ukraine are working on a 10-year military aid deal. So on Sunday, Zelensky said that the U.S. and Ukraine are working on a 10-year bilateral security deal that would include long-term commitments for U.S. military aid. So the U.S. and other NATO countries agreed to negotiate bilateral deals with Ukraine at the alliance's summit in Vilnius last year. Ukraine has already signed several of these agreements with other NATO countries, and Zelensky said that he was hoping to make the deal with the U.S. the strongest of all, as the U.S. is by far Ukraine's biggest backer. Zelensky said, quote, "Our team, Ukraine and the United States, are currently working on a bilateral security agreement, and we are already working on a specific text. We are discussing the specific foundations of our security and cooperation. We are also working on fixing specific levels of support for this year and for the next 10 years, including arms support, financial, political, and joint arms production," end quote. So he's saying that they're working on fixed spending levels when it comes to things like military aid over 10 years. Last year, the Wall Street Journal reported that the purpose of the bilateral security deals was to lock in long-term support for Ukraine to ensure that it would be difficult for a future president to exit. So this is the idea, just so they just want to lock this in. They just want to keep this thing going for as long as they can. And I remember last year before the Vilnius summit, there was all this talk about, oh, is Ukraine going to get invited to join NATO? Nobody seriously thought that they were, but they wanted to give them something. And one of the ideas being floated was the Israel model. Israel gets a set amount of military aid each year under a 10-year memorandum of understanding. It's $38 billion over 10 years, $3.8 billion a year. But they don't have like an Article 5 mutual defense guarantee. Now, obviously, the big difference between the U.S. relationship with Israel and Ukraine at this point is that the U.S., as we've seen, will intervene directly to defend Israel, something that they're not going to do for Ukraine because, of course, that means war with Russia. Although I'm sure there are, some nutcases in Washington who do want war with Russia. That's not something that Biden is going to do. Zelensky spoke with Hakeem Jeffries. He's the top Democrat in the House, and he asked for more weapons. The Biden signed the $61 billion last week. They announced actually a total of $7 billion in new weapons for Ukraine. I'll get to that in the next story. And Zelensky's still pleading for more. He's saying that they're waiting for the supplies that are promised. They got to deliver them more quickly. He needs Patriot missiles. He's got to join the EU. He's got to join NATO. Just making all these demands. He's overseeing this completely unwinnable war, dragging young Ukrainian men to go fight it. This is just what he's got to do, I guess, is just keep begging for more assistance from the West. All right, so the next one here, the Pentagon unveils a $6 billion arms package for Ukraine. So this article's from Will Porter. So they really outdid themselves this time. If you remember last week, they had that I covered, there was a $1 billion weapons package. And then on Friday, the U.S. announced $6 billion, which is double the biggest one that they've given Ukraine. Now, this is a little different. This is under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which is different than the Presidential Drawdown Authority, they call it. That's when they send weapons directly from U.S. military stockpiles. The Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, is when they buy weapons for Ukraine. So that means they're not going to be delivered for a while, most likely. So the $6 billion will pay for 155 millimeter, 152 millimeter artillery shells, Switchblade and Puma drones. Those are small drones, as well as additional munitions for the U.S.-made HIMARS rocket systems. Other types of there's some ammunition for the Patriot air defense systems and other types of air defense. You know, if you look at the list that the Pentagon put out, it's not really that long. You know, I don't know how this is going to make up $6 billion. I guess it's just lots of ammunition, maybe over a long period of time. But so this was, you know, Biden signed the $61 billion last week, and then they announced they're using $7 billion of it already. So they're using it pretty quickly. All right, so the next one here, U.S. intelligence agencies say that Putin did not order Navalny's death. So the Wall Street Journal reported on Saturday that U.S. intelligence agencies believe Russian President Vladimir Putin likely did not order the killing of opposition figure Alexei Navalny, who died earlier this year while serving a 19-year sentence in a penal colony in Siberia. So in the aftermath of Navalny's death, President Biden immediately blamed Putin, and the U.S. and some other Western countries imposed new sanctions on Russia. Biden said, and again, this is right after Navalny died, he said, quote, "We don't know exactly what happened, but there is no doubt that the death of Navalny was the consequence of something that Putin and his thugs did," end quote. So this Wall Street Journal report said that the idea that Putin likely did not order Navalny's death is broadly accepted within the intelligence community and is the view of the CIA, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, and the State Department's Intel Wing. The cause of Navalny's death is unclear. I've seen the head of Russia's intelligence service, actually their foreign intelligence service, said that he died of natural causes. He died at 47 years old. And Russian media, and also the head of Ukraine's military intelligence agency, said that Navalny died of a blood clot. Last month, Putin said that he had been willing to exchange Navalny for Russians who are detained abroad under the conditions that he couldn't return to Russia. And according to this Wall Street Journal report, President Biden and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz actually discussed the idea just a week before Navalny died, discussed the idea of swapping Russians for Navalny. So that's kind of interesting. But another thing, you know, again, Biden, I think it was like the same day that he died that Biden said that. All right, so the next one here, the Houthis down a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone for the third time. So a military spokesman for Yemen's Houthis announced on Saturday that their forces downed a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone that was operating over Yemen and was carrying out a hostile mission. U.S. officials confirmed to CBS News that a U.S. Air Force MQ-9 drone crashed in Yemen early Friday morning and said they're investigating the cause. So the U.S. hasn't come out and confirmed that the Houthis downed the drone, but I would guess that they did and that they are right in this claim because the Houthis have done this before. And MQ-9 Reaper drones usually don't just crash. And if they crashed over a country that the U.S. is bombing, it just seems like a big coincidence. But MQ-9s are estimated to cost $30 million each, so the Houthis have downed 3 of these since November. That totals $90 billion. And the U.S. has said that it's used about $1 billion in munitions in this new war against the Houthis in Yemen and the Red Sea, and other operations in the Middle East that have started due to Israel's slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. And the Houthis also said that they hit a British-owned oil tanker, the Andromeda Star. That was confirmed by the U.S. military, said the damage was minor. But this continues the situation Despite this U.S. and British bombing campaign, the Houthis aren't stopping, and they've been very clear that a ceasefire in Gaza will get them to stop. And U.S. officials have said that they think that they would stop if there was a ceasefire. All right, so then the last one here, Blinken concludes China visit by threatening sanctions. So this article is from Kyle. He wrote this on Friday. This is really something. So Blinken goes to China. I didn't really pay much attention to his trip, but Blinken, who's supposedly a diplomat, supposedly America's top diplomatic official, goes to China for 3 days, and he ends it lecturing China about its relationship with Russia, basically threatening sanctions, threatening more economic pain if China does not end exports that help Russia's industrial sector. And this is, we saw Jens Stoltenberg make similar comments last week, saying that China has to reduce trade with Russia if it wants better relations with the West. So Blinken, again, he said this in Beijing. He said, quote, "Now, even as we seek to deepen cooperation where our interests align, the United States is very clear-eyed about the challenges posed by the PRC." That's the People's Republic of China. The PRC is providing components that are powering Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. China is the top supplier. Dual-use items that Moscow is using to ramp up its defense industrial base. I made clear that if China does not address this problem, we will. I also expressed our concern about the PRC's unfair trade practices and the potential consequences of industrial overcapacity for global and U.S. markets, end quote. So if China doesn't address this problem, we will. And, you know, I mean, if you just know even like a little about China, a lecture from a foreign diplomat from a Western country, that's not going to get them to change their minds. I mean, it's just like, I don't know what these people are thinking that this is going to work, that you can go over there and say this. You know, I wonder, I'm curious to know what the private conversations were really like. But the U.S. and China, there's been a lot of talks, but it doesn't seem like there's really any progress to reduce tensions. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ramsey Baroud, Feeding War, Killing Peace, Why the U.S. Vetoed Palestine. One from Daniel McAdams, Tin Soldiers and Nixon Coming, about the protests erupting around at the colleges. One from Stephen M. Walt, It's Not Too Late for Restrained U.S. Foreign Policy. One from Ted Snyder, What Killed the Peace Talks in Ukraine. One from J.S. King, and L. Solemn, We're Jewish Students at Columbia Arrested for Protesting Israel's War. And we have a lot of stuff. The lower section of the page is a whole like protest section. There's a lot going on across the country at these different colleges with all these protests. So if you want to go check some of that stuff out. But yeah, that's it. There's a lot of stuff to go over today. Seemed like a lot happened over the weekend. But again, please help us with our fundraiser, antiwar.com/donate. If you can't do that, you could help us in other ways by sharing, liking, subscribing, commenting, telling your friends about antiwar.com. That's it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.